Yeah, and just to come back, because I need to clear that up. Like, I grew up and I was like, Arabs are cool, Afghans are cool. They have all this cool poetry. They have all this cool mathematics. They have all this cool like kindness. Like, where the hell did all that talk come from? And you grow up and you realize like it's just old ways of thinking that are rooted in that feeling of wanting to actually become closer to the people that feel most like you and represent you, and in an effort to feel closer to the other that most looks like you, thinks like you. It's group thinking, and it's group thinking that permeates like race, ethnicity, religion. And in an effort to do that, you end up like pushing other cultures and races away. And it's a disgusting thing that still exists. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, D-Gens and D-Genettes, to another episode of the Alfalfa podcast. We are four radically moderate entrepreneurs and investors swimming in the messy gray ocean, serving up alpha in money, politics, and life. We are Nick Urbani, Eric Johansson, Steven Cesaro, and Arman Asadi. All links at alfalfapod.com. Please subscribe, please support, please tell your friends all about us, and follow us on the socials. Hop in our Discord, which is at the same link to talk to us in between episodes. We are on to the next segment today, which is on racism. And like I was saying at the end of the last episode, there is literally no other podcast or community that I know that is willing to take on these topics in such a nuanced way and literally play out our metaphor of swimming in the messy gray ocean. So I'm very excited for this. Where this kicked off, or where this really begins, is in the last episode. We were discussing Sri Lanka. And let's actually begin with a little tinfoil Eric recognition.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I think that's the most important part. So what did you say exactly? You were like, Biden's on his way out.
So I
had
said,
the tinfoil
I mean,
on.
we were talking about Boris Johnson. My tinfoil hat was on.
Yeah.
Boris Johnson got forced out. He resigned as Prime Minister of England, but he was forced out. And I said, guess who's next? Joe Biden is next, and they're going to blame it on his health. And that's going to be his out. But he's going to be forced out next. And just an hour ago or so, we read on Twitter.
July 20th.
Yeah, here we go. July 20th. We just listened to a clip of him saying that he has skin cancer, melanoma or something. And like, this is just setting the stage.
Yeah.
Tinfoil.
Dude, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely
I just want the credit. And you guys already gave me the credit, but like I need to keep this thing going.
Yeah. No, please do. So I think tinfoil could end up being one of these things that just like Nostradamus just fucking just gets everything right. No, totally. Please keep
wear
it
it
going.
on the next episode.
Yeah. Please.
We need a tinfoil channel in the Discord where he just goes in top of mind and prognosticates on stuff.
I mean, you were right. 100%. And I think the White House now has responded by saying like, no, it was like from before, like a few years ago. But really that's a way of like reducing the excitement, if you will, around the topic and setting the stage and just slowly going to unravel until the point where it's like, give him a dignified way to step down, which is what needs to happen anyway.
I love that White House cleanup crew.
Yeah. Oh, they're
remember
best.
January?
Did you see the one?
No, the president didn't say he would do nothing if Russia invaded Ukraine. That was just
it's a full-time job.
It's just it was like a metaphor.
Just this last one, the repeat the line one. They said he didn't say that.
Oh my God!
They never touched on the
said repeat the line.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Your choice. I forget what they did. Did you see it, Nick?
Yeah, he said end of quote. Repeat the line. Or
but the White House said.
Oh, they changed the transcript.
Yeah, they changed the transcript. They changed the transcript.
So it wasn't like end of quote. It was just like quote.
Yes.
Or something.
Yeah.
It was
some bullshit. And if you listen to it, it's like
they don't know the internet exists.
Anyway, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about racism, and by far the most racist person here is you, Eric. So we're going to focus on you.
I thought you were going to say Joe Biden.
No,
some would argue that we all are.
Yeah, some would. And where we began this discussion, that was a joke for everybody. Where we began this discussion was with Sri Lanka, $4 billion debt that they defaulted on. And meanwhile, the figures are kind of being looked up, 50 billion, 60 billion, 70 billion, something like that.
I feel like we shipped 80 billion to Ukraine.
Yeah. And the numbers just keep on stacking.
Hold on, Jamie's looking it up.
We're only a few months into this thing.
And just last week it was another billion. So
you have 10x, 10x, let's just say 10x has gone to Ukraine, that zero of which has gone
Zero.
to Sri Lanka. And Eric made a joke because I feel like even fucking Chamath could have probably bailed them out or something. So the point is that kind of sparked a discussion about race. And you can look at that on a government level as a resource question, as a racism question, as a who does our country and other Western countries look to align with question. Is this about whiteness? Is this about being a Western nation? What is this about? And to that, we would say, go think about that on your own. Because really, that's just a leaping off point to I think the deeper meat of the idea of racism as a whole.
Yeah, it just got us thinking about racism, and we
Exactly.
want to dig into racism and pull that apart because that topic alone is so taboo. But I feel like this group can talk about that without getting at each other, and like maybe even not without having other people get at us. That would be fascinating.
That would be nice. So I think there's a few things that I personally propose to do. One is to get through the actual definitions and semantics around the terms that are used today with racism and prejudice and bigotry and discrimination, so that we define the terms correctly so that people, as they're listening and as we're debating, are clear of what we're actually arguing for. Because oftentimes what you see in the world is people don't agree to the semantics up front, and then they talk past each other very easily. So let's first set that stage. And there is no right answer there, by the way, to everybody listening. Like, we're going to set a stage and have some definitions and then work within those definitions, because otherwise we're not working anywhere. I think the other thing that's interesting is to actually look at, like, are human beings innately then racist, and where does that come from? And then I'd be curious how you guys feel, like, individually. Like, have you seen it? Have you experienced it? Like, that's just something I would personally like to get to if we have time. So let's begin with some definitions. Stephen.
Oh, you'd like me to define racism?
Yes, please.
Okay. I mean, I can give you a sort of take on it. I feel like what everybody, not everybody, but with most people I talk to, when you say, like, okay, so racism, is this like a neutral thing, or is this like a bad thing? Most people are like, oh, it's bad. They're like, okay, so there's like some bad intent wrapped up in it. Most people I know are like, yes. So I feel like when I think of racism, to me, it's a assumption of somebody on the basis of how they look that is sort of also grounded in some assumption of that person being also inferior on the basis of that physical appearance. Like, that's what it means, like, to me. I feel like it doesn't mean that in all of society anymore. It's gotten broadened out to the point where it's just like anything anybody says on the basis of the way you look, and it's not even people saying stuff on the basis of how you look anymore. It's just like, oh, there's these outcomes that are different in society for this group. Racism.
Yeah, this already makes me want to jump to the current societal.
Yeah.
But let's just.
This is a good preface.
But like to me, racism is a very clear thing. It's like you are making an assumption of inferiority on the basis of the way somebody looks. To me, it's like inherently negative, and it has an intent attached to it, which I think is like really important.
You nailed it in such a precise way, and I can't wait to get
Literally,
into nuance.
pigment, the skin. That's all we're talking about.
But what he
and
said-
this idea of, like, well, racism doesn't have any malice within it. We're gonna not use that version. Are we agreeing on that?
Well, I mean,
as a whole?
does anybody think that the version of racism where there's no intent involved, that does that have merit?
Some
to
people
anybody?
do, so I want to
A lot
clarify
of people
that,
do.
that
Like
we're going into
the
that.
the loudest people on the left. Like, I don't think they're the majority of the left, and they're not the majority of the country. But like, those people seem to not care about the intent part of it at all.
Yeah.
Right. But
That's a whole clusterfuck.
I think that's silly.
It's like all that matters.
One
intent
thing that
matters.
I also want to propose is, like, again, this idea of, like, racism is one way to discriminate. It's one way to show or exhibit prejudice. Prejudice, and one thing that I think we need to get into is, like, is this something you learn, or is this something you're essentially born with as a survival mechanism. But the point is, racism, the pigment, color of the skin, is one version of prejudice and discrimination. There are other versions. There's sexism. There's prejudice based on political beliefs. There's prejudice based on religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, language that you use. Again, I used this example recently. I'm like, one of the most, and I'm sorry if this offends anybody, but this episode in general might be offensive to a lot of people. But like one thing that I've learned over the years about India, after having many Indian friends, is that India is one of the most racist places on the planet. By far.
Based on the caste system, is that what you're alluding to?
It's not just the caste system. The caste system was the root of it in many ways, in which it was positioned and in which people understood classism. That was classism.
Yeah.
But the racism that exists between the Hindus and the Muslims, the ones in the north and the south, the ones that are darker versus lighter, it's such a melting pot of differences of languages. I mean, some people say there's like 1,000 languages and dialects. And so each of these things, language, the color of the skin, the religion, the class that they're born into, which was from the caste system, again, was one piece
is
again.
a form of prejudice, like you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah, is
But
that
I don't-
racism?
but I
I'm
don't
just
wanna-
trying to broaden us to show that
Talk
like
about
there is a larger
prejudice,
pie here.
Prejudice exists in
Yes.
terms of like sexual preference, gender, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you.
It can go on and on. I don't like the idea of singling out any nation in terms of prejudice, because every single
No, we could.
populace is guilty
I could
of
give
this.
you. I could give you 20 million
Dude,
more.
I've traveled the whole world, and the U.S. is actually kind of advanced in this way.
Yes.
Like we're less prejudiced than a lot of other places that I've lived and been to. But yeah, let's keep going, because I get what you're setting up here, which is like a conversation that is
one example.
yeah. But I just don't want to like pinpoint. one.
No, of course not. But again, you see this in Europe, where there's differences of religion, and these people are white. These are Europeans, and yet there's differences of religion or differences of beliefs, and that creates something that's beyond, I think, racism. So racism that we're going to kind of get into then is what? Are we really just focused on the color of the skin aspect of this? Or can we go beyond that to also prejudice and discrimination as a whole, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think racism and bigotry are similar, but I think bigotry is a general belief that because of some trait that is sort of observable, person or group is inferior. I think racism is probably a subset of bigotry.
It's a little more acute.
Yeah, like so I think like two cultures that are the exact same race but have different religions, for example, and one thinks the other is inferior. That's probably bigotry, right? Not racism. And I also think like discrimination is a totally different, sort of more nuanced subset of that is mostly less severe, but can also be just as severe. Like I think bad discrimination becomes bigotry or racism, but there's an element of discrimination that is just basic, like encoded in your DNA, human stuff. Like humans on an everyday basis discriminate.
Yeah.
We discriminate between a ton of things, but then there are certain things that we start discriminating on where it gets like very like, and it's weird because we all like inwardly acknowledge that we are programmed to do this to a degree. And then there's like a denial of it, right? And there's in America, I think it's an overcorrection. Like people are so off the rails in America, right? That we've gone from like overt racism being the problem to systemic racism, and now it's like implicit bias, right? At first it was like, don't lynch black people. That's bad. We can all agree that that's bad, right? And then we're like, yeah, that's obviously bad. We're like, thank God. Okay. Let's not deny people services in the system on the basis and we're like that makes sense. But then it got to the point where it's just like now some workplaces have training where you're like, do you know that you're subconsciously thinking this thing and you're not even aware that you're thinking it?
Well, only white people are born that way.
I think this is another issue, but I think it's true from what I've seen. Like I think white people in America, especially like white liberals, like this whole like white guilt concept.
It's so
do
funny.
you know Shelby Steele?
No.
Shelby Steele is kind of like a Thomas Sowell type guy. He's like a conservative black guy. He's like very smart, written a lot of stuff. Kind of in the, what's the other guy? Walter Whitman. I can't remember. Walt Whitman. Yeah, but he writes about this a lot. He has a book. It's called White Guilt, and he sort of postulates that like white people have this, like, not all white people, but this particular subset of white people we're thinking about, they have this sort of like inborn that guilt that they overcompensate for. But then he goes a step further and says, like, actually it's not even them being good people to doing it. It's like this like weird underhanded attempt to like regain power in a perverse way by like turning the tables and like and then he like argues in that book that it's actually like inherently racist in a way that they don't recognize that they're being racist. Like sometimes we talk about these topics and it's like this, like
It's kind of like the video that you posted or somebody posted recently. It's like the woke person and the racist guy, like two friends.
Oh, Ryan,
talking.
What's his face?
It's
It's like the
funny,
woke guy and the white supremacist guy.
Very funny like YouTube skit about two guys that say the same things and they believe the same statements, and yet one feels that they're in defense of racism and the other is a blatant racist. And in the pursuit of this leftist ideology of the defense of racism and looking out for groups, you end up sort of perpetuating the same ideas.
Do you remember any of those statements that were like equal on those sides?
No, I'm not good at that. I don't remember jokes like that, but they were so good.
His name's Ryan Long, right?
Yeah, there you go, Ryan Long. Well, so the reason I bring that up is because one point that I think is really interesting is that the first thing I'd like to like take the myth, take the air out of. It's like, I think this is just like a myth. Racism is often looked at as a white person problem in the Western world. That's the first thing I want to move past. The reason I brought up the example of India, let me use another better example where I can personally like own it. I'm Persian. I went to Iran, actually, to be specific, one time when I was a kid. I was like 7 years old. I was just visiting, but I wasn't born there. I was born in the U.S. But I know plenty of Iranian people, Persian people, and one of the things that I heard growing up was an attitude of looking down on Afghan people and Arab people. And I always wondered why. And there were comments that were made that were very rude, very disgusting, about these people are dirty, they're uncivilized, they don't have the education that we do. And I'm like a kid hearing these things. And I'm not talking, by the way, about like my parents. They're incredible. I'm talking about like you just kind of hear it in general and culture. And oftentimes from people that are like a little bit less educated, to be honest. Like somebody who makes that kind of statement is like a little bit less educated. But then at times it could be somebody's grandma. Like it just could be some like old school thinking. Like, and it's just something that you see oftentimes. Somebody in our community said that like their Albanian grandmother makes like very ridiculous racist jokes like that. It's something that's a little bit old school. The point I'm making is like, we're not white. There's nothing white about, well, I mean, technically, yeah. But like when you look at a Persian person, like you don't see someone who's like a white person in like England, okay? And yet you see this like discrimination and prejudice occurring. So why is that occurring? Well, first of all, it's occurring with Persians, and it's always occurring because of some injustice or something around classism. So with Iranians, it's occurring because it's like, the Arabs conquered Persia and forced religion onto them. So they have this like bad taste in their mouth. The Bosnians and the Serbs have like a bad taste in their mouth about each other. And you can go on and on about former Yugoslavia as a whole. And it has nothing to do with the color of the skin, but it's this general hatred. I mean, there was somebody this past weekend that brought up like the Armenian genocide and like what they wish they could do to Turkish people. And even Armenians. And I was like, whoa, that was really shocking. You're like my age and you just said something really shocking. And this exists across all ages, all levels, all everything. So this is not a white America problem. This is a problem that white America that the media likes to perpetuate as a white America problem that was rooted in slavery. Slavery was a terrible, disgusting thing, but so have been all the other genocides that have occurred and all the other slavery that has occurred around the world. It's not a white America problem. I'm curious if anybody disagrees with that, but I think that's the first thing to like debunk is that the word racist is for some reason attached to white people.
Totally.
I think it's wrong.
And I think I just want to build on your point that like there might be black people that would be offended that we're like measuring their plight against somebody else's, and we're not. We're just saying that like shit has gone down with every cultural group within humanity, and like it always leads itself to become tribal in a way, and like this shit is at a human level existing no matter what your race or ethnicity or whatever it is. It's like it just permeated all of existence.
Yeah, and just to come back, because I need to clear that up. Like I grew up and I was like, Arabs are cool, Afghans are cool. They have all this cool poetry. They have all this cool mathematics. They have all this cool like kindness. Like where the hell did all that talk come from? And you grow up and you realize like it's just old ways of thinking that are rooted in that feeling of wanting to actually become closer to the people that feel most like you and represent you. And in an effort to feel closer to the other that most looks like you, thinks like you, it's group thinking. And it's group thinking that permeates like race, ethnicity, religion. And in an effort to do that, you end up like pushing other cultures and races away. And it's a disgusting thing that still exists.
Do you think it's a biological evolutionary trait? Because I do imagine that like if you form groups, you probably have a stronger survival probability. You know, like tight groups.
That's where I landed. Yes.
Yeah, you're being generous on this. Like you're saying that people did
Watch
this,
your mic, by the way.
And they could be closer if not for it or something. But like, don't you think that there is this like ugly truth that like back in the day, like there was some truth to these things. Like people did it out of a means for survival. Like
Definitely.
The world wasn't always this like coexist, let's all merge into one happy human race type place. Like for most of humanity, everybody was like in a battle for scarce resources and sort of trying to kill one another, and humans were super tribal creatures. And in like the very old days, like that was very extreme, and then we broke into cultures and countries and we maintained some of that tribalism. But some of it, like some of the stuff your grandparents said, like even though it seems out of place and bad in the modern world, it can be too easy to like dismiss where it came from. Mm-hmm. Not that the other people they talk about are inherently bad and they're inherently good, but that everybody was fighting each other at a certain point. Like everybody was battling for scarce resources. And maybe it's not the case that all of our ancestors were like bad people, but maybe they like had a reason to think this way in that world. They just evolved to think that way, you know, and it's too simplistic to just dismiss them as bad.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
Totally agree with that.
Right? I mean, when we had a world full of homogenous groups, a less multicultural world, less globalism, it was a lot harder to move around. You had tribal groups of people that were fairly homogenous, and they looked very similar to each other. They had similar upbringings, similar ethnicities. And so, yeah, when a bunch of people that look different from you show up on boats with wood and metal objects that have triggers on them, it's probably good that you might distinguish, that as like a potential danger. And I think,
but is that racist? Like even let's just say in like Scandinavia, there's like prejudice between Norway and Sweden and Finland. They're all the same.
yeah.
Where does that come from?
No,
It comes from the survival.
Chinese don't like the Japanese, and like,
Right.
And if you're like a white bystander in America, you're like, oh, why are these funny Asian people all like hated? You just like lump them all together.
Okay, that was a great example.
That wasn't my thought. That was my thought of a ignorant American bystander. But people do that. They're being racist because they're like, why are all these people from Asia? Aren't they the same?
Every
And
time
they're
you
like,
say a cancelable thing, you have to drink.
Oriental, by the way, is
we-
completely gone. I haven't heard that in like
Please
what,
don't say
15
that
years.
word. So we have like a
Is
we
that
need a
just
racist
gone?
we need a racist bell.
Things our
We need
grandparents
like
said.
a bell.
Yeah.
Ring the bell. We did like a jar, like a tip jar for cigars later.
It's funny though. like,
Totally.
Oriental was never something that I ever deemed offensive. Being an Asian kid, like
Neither
like,
did I. I
never touched me in a way that like. And this goes back to Steven's original point, where it's like intent. Racism is completely based on intent. And
Now you're getting to
the
something.
simplest example of that is that black people can say the N-word to each other, and that's not racist. That's not offensive. But then you can also be
Hold on.
another person.
I
who
said
that.
the N-word 7 times a day growing up, and they said it to me, and I said it to white people,
Yes.
and brown people, and yellow people, and black
Thank
people.
you. And I don't want to focus on the
It
N-word.
wasn't
like,
actually just black people that were
Right.
allowed to say it to you, and I'm sure you would agree because you're from Sacramento too. We all said it.
Totally.
It was about
Really?
intent.
Everything
all
you
the
just
time.
said, like you said that, and I went,
all the time.
Because
Pick up
it's-
the phone.
my face
hello,
just,
N-word.
my face just went like,
It's
what?
all about it's like
No,
as the
bro.
recipient of words, it's all about you can understand
bro.
the other person's intent behind it. And like, you know, I grew up Asian, so like I could tell when some like I got a group of white friends in the middle of America that when I go out there, they're like, "What up, soy sauce?" And it's with love. And it could be completely
I
somebody.
heard that this past weekend.
Yeah,
There was someone at your bachelor party. I think that
I
was
was
the
just gonna
name
say,
in
exactly.
their phone for you.
Oh,
I
dude,
hadn't
I was
heard
like,
it before, but then I figured it out.
My
Like,
invitation-
Oh, it's soy sauce.
my invitation to the motherfucker's wedding said soy sauce and Mina. Like it's love.
It is love.
But some other motherfucker could say that to me, and I could feel completely different about the exact same name because
Correct.
it's about intent.
Yes, we're getting to the heart of the matter.
Dude, this is wired deep. Like what you just said is like so Ziggy. Where's Ziggy? Where's my cute dog?
Upside down
Okay.
against the wall.
So if I go to sort of pet Ziggy and he loves me, he will roll over. He will like expose his neck to me, and that's like a sign of affection, right? So when you say this to each other, it's like this. It's this verbal way of like exposing yourself. And because you guys can like expose these like vulnerable parts to each other and like jab each other in that way, it's like a bonding mechanism. It's like what you turn what was like a sort of defensive thing into a bonding mechanism. So when you see these like all these like clips on TV with the guys in New York and they're just like there's like a white guy and a black guy and a Puerto Rican guy and hanging out, and the white guy's like, "Oh, you Puerto Rican motherfucker," and there's like,
Yeah.
and then one other guy comes up, he's like, "Yeah, you Puerto," and he's like, "I'll fucking kill you."
You're right.
Because the context, the context matters, the intent matters, and like there is this human thing where you bond by being vulnerable, and we see this in a lot of
But
elements of humanity.
The most important part of that is that we have banned intent. Intent is no longer at play. The word itself is violence. That's the scariest part of what exists today. Like another funny thing that happened over the last weekend at Eric's bachelor party. It was like, there was this idea of like somebody said, "What kind of brown?" And then the joke was like 9/11 brown or 7-Eleven brown. I thought that was so hilarious.
Oh my god!
I thought it was so hilarious. I was
I've
like,
never heard that
I never quite put that into. And one of the guys was Pakistani, and I was like, oh, you're both. So I've never quite created those like paradigms. I think that's funny.
But it was
That's
still all
what-
love.
It's
That's the
all
beauty.
love. It's like that's what the
depends
90s
on-
used to be
depends on
like.
context.
That's what even the 2000s used to be like. And you're not allowed to say that because everyone is a victim now.
Right.
And guess who's standing up for everybody? White people in America. Like doing the battle for all the minorities, and the minorities are louder than ever as well. But like white people in America feel like, okay, first I'm supposed to feel guilt. And then I'm supposed to stand up for every group that's ever existed and put all their needs above mine. So I'm basically supposed to learn what like racism, and then they start learning about racism, and then the solution to the racism is to be racist. And then we're back in this like crazy negative feedback loop of like we're solving racism with racism.
Okay,
That's all we're doing.
That's a cool conversation.
Yeah,
because-
this is where I like this
okay,
conversation.
Nick, come
now.
on in. Come on in.
Well, I think what you're talking about is when we move from the goal to be racial neutral to being anti-racism. That becomes the goal, and I think is what
race neutral is not anti-racism.
No, that's what he's saying.
right. That's what
Oh.
I'm saying. I'm saying.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I guess this
Okay.
is where this is in this whole conversation where I get very confused because I thought
A lot of words these days.
Yeah, I
lot
thought
of
the
words.
idea of equality was that we want to be racist neutral, which is like the race, the color of your skin, your ethnicity has no moral standing more than your eye color or your hair
Exactly.
color.
You don't take it into consideration.
Like, and the
Isn't that what
goal
it
is
used
that
to be?
I don't know.
That was the
maybe,
aim
Maybe
before.
it's never been like that.
I think the difference is that now we're arguing for equality of outcome, not just opportunity. Equality of opportunity is your eye color, my eye color, different, no worries. Let's
Right.
get where we need to go as long as we start from the same place.
And that's very scary, right? Because when you have institutions, you have people, you have influential people who kind of make their reputation or potentially their living and the way they kind of go about their lives and they communicate their perspective on life about being anti-racist, they want to see these things continue on. And they also, inherent in that is this idea that like we will never get beyond racism. There'll never be a post-racism world. And I don't know if I like that. I don't know if someone like Martin Luther King would put that out there. I think what we want is...
Opposite of equality.
Right, it's the opposite of equality. And so it's while these, these anti-racist movements may be, well, they have good intent. Speaking of intent, maybe most of these have good intent. I don't know if they accomplish the goal that we want, and they could put us in a position that's worse off, where
That's a good point.
we don't believe that we can get past it.
Can we define like I feel like we're playing like a game right now, and there's like various players in the game. And I'm going to throw out the groups, and you can add or subtract, right? There are the actual bad racist people with like negative intent, like your sort of neo-Nazis, people who like literally think brown people are inferior.
Yeah.
They're your casually, unintentionally racist people, right? Like your nice little grandma. Do
Do you think that's the middle of the bell curve, like the majority of the folks?
I don't think so. I think the majority of the bell curve is people who are not intentionally racist, not overtly racist. They're just sort of existing in life. They're observing everything happening, and they don't feel like picking a battle. They think everything is
But
kind
some
of
stuff might be existing in the subconscious.
in the subconscious, sure.
Yeah.
But I just think that's a human condition.
Back to grandma. Grandma's doing it because that was the cultural norm for the
Yes.
time.
So intent, doing it but not intentional, not really doing it, not taking an active position, sort of neutral observer. Then you have the people who are like, I am a warrior. I am very against this. I'm a good person, and whatever these people are telling me to believe or do, I am on board with it no matter what, because I am good and I am virtuous. And then you have people on the other end who are sort of like the aggrieved people who may actually in and of themselves be racist, but to non-white people, and then we sort of just change the definition of what racism is, but that's like another story, so we'll like ignore that, right? I think those are all the players, right? And I think in this group on the left here, you have a divide between people who are genuinely feel bad and genuinely want to help, but then I think there are also like cynical people in that group and who use this as this sort of like power game to exploit people.
Exactly.
They don't care to enact change in the world. They're just playing a power game. And some of them, and even within the power game, there's a further divide. There's some people who think that like, it's a power game. I know it's a power game, but this is for the greater good. And with my power, I will do good.
What's an example of the power?
Yeah,
game? I don't think I follow this.
So, for example, like when we change the definition of racism to be like, oh, it's not just that you're saying mean things about somebody on the basis of their skin. You have to also be in a position of power. Otherwise, it doesn't count. Like when a black person says something racist against an Asian person, well, like the black person doesn't have any power in that dynamic, so it doesn't count. Like once you start doing that, it sort of becomes clear that you don't really care about racism. It's like a power dynamic.
Well, I can give you another example of like a power differential. Like typically, like let's say to get into a big university, most people have to go through standardized tests. But you could say, well, this minority, name the minority, has been so oppressed because of their ancestors and the systemic racism that we're not going to actually require them to go through these tests. And I think you would also file that under the power differential part. And there is a subsect of the group who views as power differentials as the main reason for racism. Has nothing to do with like how families grow up, economics, anything like that. And that's where it gets, to me, a little, we're not pointed towards the outcome that we want, because you could look at people on the, let's call them the far left, who, like you said, are the kind of like in the group that gets obsessed with the power part and say that they really believe that skin color matters and will always matter. But you could also say that for like a neo-Nazi group, right? They think that skin color really matters. It will always matter, and we have to define our world by it. It's kind of, I guess, the joke of that. It's the joke of that YouTube video.
Yeah, this happens in politics a lot, where when you go so far to one end of the spectrum, you go around the world and you end up back at the other end of the spectrum.
The difference, though, is we talked about intention when it comes to how you speak about race and the jokes that you make. This is another example of intention, though, where it goes wrong. And what you have is a well-meaning individual who's unfortunately been brainwashed. And I was one of them. I'll be the first to speak up. Like, I could not have been more brainwashed about the right way to be a good person in this world. This group as a whole, it's a subset of a larger group that has lost a lot of people, perpetuates an idea that to be a good person, you have to be so aware of the differences in others that you're willing to stand up for those differences. And that the mechanism to like creating equality is to make sure that we all end up in the same place. The only way to do that is through action. You have to literally change reality in the world. There's this, like, I think it was one of the first things I learned from Thomas Sowell. We've brought him up before. He said, and it might have been one of the first quotes that you shared, Stephen. It was like, if you can't create equality in a household, you have a brother and a sister or two or three,
or even
brothers
twins is the
example. Same zip code, the same, like, because we always say the biggest
Same house,
determinant,
same family.
the biggest determinant of success is the zip code you're born in, right? Same zip code, same parents, same dysfunction or wealth, same everything, same education. One ends up being an astronaut and the other ends up being a drug addict. That's an extreme example, but why is that? So if you can't create, because why? Because it's fucking choice. They're left up to choice. It doesn't matter what you give people. If you give people the starting line that is equal, like that family example, it is up to them to choose what they would like to do with that. And that part about outcome that we're trying to exercise control over out of this well-intentioned thing of we want to be an evolved society, a progressive society where everybody is treated equally. You could not have a more terrible way of achieving the outcome that is most important, which is equality of opportunity. The only way to do that, in my opinion, is for people to become conscious, aware, and respectful of the differences, to appreciate them, to have positive intent when they speak about somebody, to be able to make humor and jokes about other people and it be okay, not an act of violence. Like, I think that ultimately that's truly the only way to solve this problem.
Well, I mean, you could go beyond that, and which some activists have, and say, well, we should teach this in school. Like you said, we should appreciate our differences, and well, white student, you should understand that like you are come from a lineage of oppressors, and African American student, you come from a long line of victims, and right. We should let you know that ahead of time so that you can appreciate those differences and change your behavior. So there is like a little.
Should you pay the price for your privilege for the rest of your life?
Oh God.
Because that works.
But like, isn't the North Star at the end of the day is that like this shit doesn't even matter? So like, why even teach it? Because like, what you should teach is that like at the end of the day, like you want it to be closer to a meritocracy where it's like it doesn't matter what eye color you got. It's like who's going to be best to perform whatever you're trying to do.
So I agree with both of you. I'm just going to bring up the counter argument so we have another voice in the room. But like I think this is where the topic of structural racism comes in, like where it's
structural, systemic.
Yes, sorry, systemic might be the better word. I don't know if I like either of those words, but
I think they're used synonymously to be fair.
Yeah,
so
we
like
should definitely,
the two examples I know off the top of my head were like they make sense to me is like in the 80s, if you had possession of crack, you got a much heavier sentence than if you had white powder cocaine, and so you can immediately see where this goes, right? Like pockets of wealthy individuals who are doing cocaine, maybe even politicians and lawmakers, they had less sentences, whereas maybe like poorer households, maybe certain minorities.
I mean, I don't know. Did you know that there's like another side to this argument though?
Well, can I finish the points and then yeah. So then the idea is like, okay, well, those people went to jail for longer, and then those kids who had homes without fathers in them were disadvantaged. So the grandchildren never really had, a chance. That's an example of structural racism. You could also look at home mortgages. Some banks wouldn't loan to certain ethnicities as equally as they did with others. So therefore, they weren't have the same rights as homeownership and upward economic mobility. So those are the two examples that I know that, seem
There's so many.
seem reasonable, but I'm sure there's plenty of others.
If we want to open that door, let's open that door fully and then argue back against it. But like jobs, like getting a job with a typical Black African American name, how much harder is that? Or a Middle Eastern name after 9/11. How much harder is that for your resume to even be looked at? 100%, no question, there is a probability that the hiring manager looking at that application with that name is not going to pay the same level of attention to that application as a typical John Smith. This exists in many arenas.
So if I want a world in which skin color and ethnicity is equal to hair color and eye color, do we have to just ignore these structural systemic issues in order to just focus on, race doesn't matter?
Great question.
I'd like
great
to comment
question.
on what you just brought up, because our friend Thomas Sowell has spoken about this exact topic. Right? There's a popular study where people look at resumes on the basis of names and they discriminate on the Black names and they don't discriminate on the white names. Mm-hmm. And it seems like very damning. Now, I'm not saying this is gospel, but like what Thomas has said is that, hey, so the Obama administration at one point, for example, they forbade businesses from doing a particular type of background check on candidates. So in lieu of doing the background check, what the companies did was they made sort of like race, name level assumptions, right? So this is actually like an important thing. So Thomas Sowell talks about discrimination, and he breaks it into two categories and then one subcategory.
Right.
So there's type 1 discrimination, type 2 discrimination. And within type 1, you have type 1A and type 1B. Type 1A is sorting an individual accurately based on their relevant observable characteristics, such as their education, their work history, right? Like imagine you get a resume, you can perfectly verify the criminal record, the education, the work history, all this stuff, right? In the absence of being able to verify the actual details, what you do as like a logical human is you shift into something called discrimination type 1B, where because you can't verify some of the individual base stuff, you start using physical characteristics as a stand-in for the general population, right? And people are uncomfortable saying this, but like it's true. Like as humans, we make assumptions about other humans on the basis of their physical characteristic. I think it's easiest to do this with gender because it's less of a like, oh my God. But like men and women make a lot of assumptions about each other on the basis that they're men, on the basis that they're women. It's not always true on the individual basis, but if you take a broad sample size of men and women, right? And I'm just like, who can throw a baseball farther? Well, like statistics are going to show you that it's like going to be like 90 to 95% the man, right? So in the absence of seeing that individual's throw data, you are using type 1B discrimination. You are substituting an element of their physical in the absence of the information. So what Thomas Sowell says is that a lot of these discrepancies, like, so when you ban somebody from looking at somebody's criminal record, right?
Yeah.
What these corporations do is they go like, oh, this is a Black candidate and this is a white candidate. Well, at the very high like population level, right? You're like, well, because this person is Black, there's like a larger chance that they have a criminal record.
But now I have to go back to Nick's point. Targeting communities with crack cocaine. Where does it begin? Where's the root of the actual
I think
criminal
the crack
behavior?
cocaine thing is like semi-accurate. I think it's one of these things that's like partially
But that's
true,
one.
but not
That's
entirely
one.
true.
I don't want to get you way off course, but like.
But I think it's a different issue. I think it's a totally different
Is it?
issue. Yeah, because I'm talking
Because
about
the information, the physical information that you're going off in 1B is based on a deeper thing that could be systemic or institutional.
there's no assumptions in crack cocaine. You're just like, that's a different sort of like theory versus like I'm interviewing you and I can't know this information about you, so I'm going to just make assumptions on broad, like high level stats that negate who you are as an individual. And like people pass these laws and they think they're doing good things, but they paradoxically do bad things, and then we call it.
This is why people are upset. People are upset because the racism as a whole that exists in the first place is due to the fact that these groups that are non-white in America never had an equal starting line. So to the previous point, do you solve the systemic institutional issues by really focusing on the individual mindset and the psyche of society and saying, let's not focus so much on our differences, eye color, hair color, whatever it is. But the reality is, for the last however long, these institutions are dominated by people that make decisions based on the data that they have and the stereotypes that they have, which are perpetuated by a huge history of racism in this country and abroad in the world.
Can I point something out specifically? And this is not something I have high conviction in, so by all means fact check me on this, right? But what I think a lot of people would say about the crack versus cocaine thing is that, like, well, actually, it's not so much that white people use this and black people use this. It's some sort of element of the distribution of the drug, right? And the corollary to sort of black crack is like meth in the white community.
It is.
And then people would say that if you look at meth, you see the same incarceration rates, sentences, all this stuff, and it's all white people, but we just sort of ignore that because we don't. We look. I'm just gonna say it. Like, we don't care about the plight of like the stereotypical like white Appalachian male in this country. We don't like, and it's a swath of the country that is largely like overly addicted to drugs, overly uneducated, overly like all these bad things are happening. This is one of the reasons why Trump rose to power. He's the only people who was like, I'm going to talk to these people.
Right.
And people were like, how dare you? But like,
how do we solve this problem? So I think everything we'd set up until this point about racism at large, globally and in America, feels good. But then when you get to this question of like the institutions, it gets really murky. Because the question becomes, do you solve it? Because the way we've been solving it so far is there's a guilt and a debt.
Right. And
based on everything that's happened. And the only way to fix that debt is by changing the outcome. And if you change that outcome and you give that power, how long do you maintain that power? And at what point is it now equal where it's enough?
When is the debt repaid?
And when is the debt repaid? And when is affirmative action enough? And when are any of the... And by the way, this is already happening, regardless of what the fuck we think.
It's purely outcome-based.
It's happening in corporate America.
Equal opportunity and everything already exists. So like these are choices that have already been made.
Yeah, what we talked about earlier about test scores is affirmative action. I didn't want to use that word.
I would argue that equal opportunity doesn't really exist. I would argue that there is less equal opportunity than people on the right think, and a lot more equal opportunity than people on the left think. I do think there is some.
It's a good aim, though, right?
Back and forth here. Like the aim for equality is a noble one. It's like I said earlier, right? Where you have like, if you just isolate to the left, you have sort of like the useful idiots who just think of themselves as good people and will just go along with things because they're guilty and they just want to be good people. You have on the people who are sort of exerting the pressure, the people who genuinely think they are fighting for good, and then you have the cynical people who use this as an opportunity for a cynical power grab.
Who would you put into the woke racism crowd? Which one? Useful idiots?
Like your prototypical like latte sibling, like sort of like white liberal woman, and
like in order to prove that I am a good person, I need to take these actions or show.
Yeah, like I am like there's a reason like Robin DiAngelo goes around and gets paid tens of thousands of dollars to lecture like white people on their whiteness, and like there is a certain like religious element to this where people do want to absolve themselves of their sin. But like the problem I have with this is that like you absolving yourself of your sin on this one end and you exploiting the people wanting to absolve it, like you're not solving the problem.
You're not helping them.
You're both engaging in these like short-term things to sort of further your own incentives. One person's trying to further their own like just trying to get rid of their guilt and like raise their sort of virtue points in their circle. The other one's maybe trying to extract power or money. It's just only a small group who like genuinely cares about enacting the actual change. That's like the main problem I have with this is like most of these policies I see being pursued, like you either have to conclude that they're stupid because they're not going to solve anything that purports to be like racism, or they're cynical power grabs, right? Like most of these things do not actually solve the problems at hand. That's like my main problem with them. And then you're just left thinking, are they stupid or are they cynical?
Right. Well, a lot of the versions of like the examples of systemic racism that are used are things of the past. Like they have been abolished. Like you can't just like not make loans to a certain zip code anymore.
Redlining, right?
Yeah, you can't do redlining anymore. So like a lot of systemic racism has been squashed. And I think to Armand's question is like, well, how do you squash systemic racism? Well, you remove it, and then like over time,
Do you remove it from the institution, or do you solve it with the individual?
No, you remove it at the institutional
So
level.
how do you
it's-
remove
okay.
it from but
Systemic
a lot of people
racism
believe-
is like inherently institutional, right?
But you have a large swath of this country, America, that believes that most of our systems are racist. Judicial
Right.
system.
Yeah. But that's,
I mean, everything. I mean, name them all.
but the
Like,
bar has just been moving. At first, it was like we deserve to be in the same schools. We deserve to like buy homes. We deserve like the law is literally discriminating against us. It's written in the law, and that was obviously bad. So we removed, as far as I'm aware, all of the written in law systemic stuff.
Right.
But then we moved to it's not really written in the law, but
Just
look at the outcomes.
the subtext,
Don't you see what's happening here under the veil? So systemic racism now is not like you can point to a law on the book that discriminates against people. Now it's like, look at the outcomes here. Aren't these outcomes racist? And the answer is
I like
a little
this.
vaguer.
But I'm a bottom-up guy in this category. I think you solve the existing systemic racism that continues to exist with individuals, maybe some psychedelics. I'm not even kidding. I think that, like, especially after watching How to Change Your Mind over this last couple of days, Michael Pollan's new docuseries, I'm like, a little bit of LSD and psilocybin magic mushrooms would not hurt humanity from understanding the differences that exist. And the differences that exist are completely arbitrary and made up.
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. You can go both ways. You can go top down and bottom.
You can go, but the problem with top-down policies is that they're generally corrupt and
Well,
they result
I just
in
mean
more pain.
removing policies.
Sure,
like,
which I think we've mostly
removed.
done. But
Okay.
what we're doing now, just one other thing on this, what we're doing now is we're not removing the racism anymore. We're enacting outcomes. So like if you look at corporate America right now, if you talk to any VP, president, executive level person in corporate America and startups in particular, what are they doing? They're hiring for specific looking people. That's not a solution. The solution would be like, I want to remove my biases that exist at the application level. That would be a better solution. But instead it's like dismiss, 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 dismiss. And this name just showed up on my application desk. Hire them, whatever. I don't care how they are.
You mean like
I'm talking
quota
from experience
filling,
here.
essentially?
Quota filling,
It's
100%.
funny. It's funny that you categorize that as systemic. I categorize that as an aggregate of bottom up thinking. Like I think of that as a bunch of individuals pressuring,
because I know it's coming from the top in the examples I've spoken
in the corporations, but like
It's not
corporations
coming
got
from their
pressured to
own will.
celebrate Gay Pride Week for last month. They don't give a shit about that. It's like pressure from the bottom.
Wait, do you think there's like top-down racism in like Silicon Valley hiring? Because my perception is it's like the other way. at
No, you
this
have
point.
minorities leading
There's
the companies.
incredible amounts of like
founding the
Indian
companies.
Americans, for example, who
right.
are like CEOs of Silicon Valley companies.
Right.
Like I know people who run some of these companies, and all they talk about is like, we need more women. We need more women. We need more minority. Like that's all everybody I know talks about. Like so there's like a disconnect between what I know everybody thinks in the companies and what they're trying to do versus what the perception is. Like what I see is that society views that there should be this end outcome because as a just society who is good and non-racist, of course, 50% of the engineers should be women, 50% should be men, 8% of them should be black, and it's not like a realistic outcome for how society actually is today. Like maybe like 500 years from now, we get to the point where everything is equally divided. I still think it wouldn't be that way.
No, it never
especially
would.
among genders.
It never would.
But
This has been
against
studied.
like male races, right? Like it probably should even out. Like we just
when
isolate
people are
men.
left to their own devices, they're not just going to follow like
Well,
the
men and
distribution.
women make different choices, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think black men and Indian men and white men over long periods of time should necessarily have like huge distribution.
That's a good point.
But in the short run, like obviously things happened to Black America like decades ago, and there's carryovers from that, right? And like so we're in this good place where we want to try to like put our hand on the lever and like rectify that carryover, but there's also like an unrealistic assumption of like how quickly we can get to an equilibrium point, and we're like condemning the system because it's not at equilibrium already, even though in our hearts and minds it should be.
Yeah.
And then our only conclusion is like, oh my God, we must be racist. The system must be racist. When in reality, it just like might take a longer time to get the system to equilibrium. And we're not going to fix the system by just crowbarring a bunch of people with different skin colors into all these positions and like wash and then problem solved and like move on. That's
So-
very naive.
Can I spice this up a little bit? Because
Yeah.
I got something that I hope spices it up. This is something that Armand and I
This is
talk-
not spicy enough for you?
No, it's too much consensus. This is pretty good.
Eric
but, like,
needs a freaking ghost
Disagree.
okay, no, I think it's all fine. But I think there is. How I'm going to spice this up is that I think there is an amount of racism that is actually positive. And what I'm going to bring up is a conversation Armand and I had on a New Year's Eve. Him and I several years ago over a cigar in Mexico in like where the hell were we? Who cares?
Who
Like,
cares?
Playa del Carmen, whatever. So we're smoking cigars and we're talking about this topic. Him and I. It's 2 a.m. probably, and he goes, I always get pulled by TSA at the airport, like every time, and he's like, but I get it. He's like, because
Oh,
the
I forgot about
statistics
this.
show that guys that are my age and my ethnicity and my color are the types of guys
Yeah.
that you should pull at TSA.
Pull me.
And if they start pulling 11-year-old blonde chicks instead of me, they're doing a worse job at their job.
100%.
So
No
there-
one's willing to say that.
there's and when you said that to me, I was like, holy shit, yeah, fuck. It's like now we're walking a tightrope of like the right amount of prejudice and stereotyping, because in a way that actually makes sense.
Prejudice can be very useful.
Every
Very
human,
useful.
every sentient human who is honest with himself and non-delusional, when they're in a TSA line and they see some like 90-year-old grandma in a rocker being like pulled aside and patted down, nobody's like,
All
nobody
for
in
the
their head is
noble
like,
aim of equality.
Thank God this woman is equally
Yeah,
likely
I'm
to blow
safer
me.
now.
Nobody in their
All for
head
equality.
inwardly has that dialogue.
Now,
But
let me
we
comment on
all
this.
want to like outwardly
This was
say
your
like,
comment?
no.
Let me comment on this. It's like, do you know how much like you have to remove your own self and ego from the equation to feel that way? And I wish more people would. To be able to look at a situation objectively and say, the guys that pulled off 9/11, yeah, they're not exactly like me. They weren't Persian. You know, you had these, but imagine being from the same country even. Like, imagine being, a lot of those guys were like Pakistani, right? Imagine being Arabic. Imagine being Pakistani. How shitty that feels, right? That feels so disgusting and shitty to then from that moment on, you're going to be targeted for who you are and what you look like, because there's another 100 million people, 200 million people that look like you from that same country that committed that atrocity. And then you extrapolate that even further and you go, most people don't know the fucking difference between Pakistan and Iran, and they're just like, yeah, kind of beige looking, probably from the same region of the world. They don't give a shit. So then you lump together like a billion people into that whole category. And what do you feel when you're in my position? You feel like this is unfair. You go, my people didn't do this. This is unfair.
And
We've
specifically,
never done
you
anything.
didn't do this.
There's no act of terrorism that
Yeah.
these people have ever committed. And then, yes, of course, specifically, do I appear like I'm about to commit a crime? I was born in this country, and you have all these thoughts and emotions go through your mind. But in that moment, actually, in my opinion, the right thing to say to yourself is like, well, the data shows the probability
Type
of a
1B.
person,
This is type 1B discrimination.
the probability of a person
Right.
that was
In the
going to do
absence
that.
of-
and to
In
argue
the
against
absence of individual information.
one second, to
Yeah.
argue against myself, nothing like that has happened in a long time. So like we're still on this thing of like looking for guys like that.
Maybe it's working.
But like, yeah, maybe they're all getting pulled out at TSA. The bomb is out. We're still checking shoes, by the way. You know, we're
Yeah.
taking shoes off.
Right.
We can't let go of these things. So like, is it the right? So the point is, the probability speaks in favor of the prejudice. The stereotype exists for a reason. We all need to realize that and not take offense to that. I've learned to just be like, hey man, even if you're going to be a jackass and be aggressive with me and pull me aside and treat me like I've already done something wrong and not allow me to be innocent until proven guilty, because that's another thing that exists now. It's like treat everybody like shit up front. And then you go, well, this is just systemic racism. That's like the normal reaction. I'm a victim. All of a sudden, why am I not speaking up about being this or that? Why are you all not speaking up? Why is Steven not speaking
How
up
come
about...
nobody's standing up for me?
Exactly. And that's a fucking loser's game. That's a loser's game. That is not how we evolve society. We sit back and we say, yes, that happened, and that's the right thing to do. Let's take the people that might look like a suspect for the benefit of all. It's a utilitarian idea, and it's the right thing to do. Until all of this stuff just goes away, but it never will.
Hell yeah.
It never will.
It takes a tough kind of attitude.
Yeah, I didn't always have it though. Like again, it was one of those things where I was a victim, just like all.
Did you hear Sam Harris back in the day talk about this?
I mean, I've heard his
Like
racism and religion takes, but yeah.
I mean, he was like, when I go to the airport and I get stopped by TSA, like, although I am inwardly sort of offended, I am intellectually like, thank God they're doing something that is valid. I do look kind of more brown than the average person. I am a male of a particular age. I want them stopping me. I don't want them wasting all the resources on the white grandma in the rocker who's like 92 and can barely walk. That's obviously not a good use of I think when you do this stuff on the basis of like age and gender, people are like okay with it, right? Like if you're searching for a serial killer who like murdered 29 people with like a machete, it's probably not going to be a 92-year-old woman. It's probably not. It's almost certainly going to be a man. And people are okay with the police being like, this is like the top level information. We're going to work with that and narrow down, right? And people are okay at an airport, like not patting down like small babies for bombs and stuff, right? People get uncomfortable when it goes into the skin color thing, and rightfully so sometimes. But like there also are differences in society between people with different skin colors behave different ways, different cultures behave different ways. Like if we step out of America, like we said in the real world, but elsewhere in the world, like different cultures view different people differently. We are like way less sort of racist than like a lot of these other cultures are.
Can we just recognize how like we're so hard on this country, on the United States about racism? We're so like all of the things that we've discussed have started and ended and are birthed in this country, like the ideas. And yet the most difficult feat in the world to pull off is what the United States has pulled off. A melting pot of religions, races, ethnicities that was founded on freedom of religion. And it's had many moments that we could look at it and be, scrutinize the way things have gone. But that's good. That's what creates that evolution. But I just feel like as a whole, people are overly cynical about the way things are.
Well,
they don't appreciate it
We've
enough.
gotten it more right than anyone else.
1,000 times more right. Europe is so racist compared to us.
No doubt.
Australia is racist compared
Oh,
to us.
yeah.
Shout out, I love everybody out there, and I'm more of a European at heart than anything, but like it's pretty racist out there. America is so understanding and accepting of people as a whole. I don't think we celebrate that enough.
Yeah, we don't. It's not perfect. Obviously, we can make it better, but like we really do. Like I don't know. Like if you were a hypothetical minority, maybe you would consider yourself a minority. You were to be born into the world tomorrow. Like what country would you want to be just
100%
born into in the dark? Maybe we're not number one here, but like I got to imagine we're like top 5 or something, right? Like we have pretty good outcomes here, and they can be improved upon. But this isn't some like horrible racist nation. I hate that. The other question I would pose to you guys is like, what percentage of this stuff that we call racism is actually racism versus race being a stand-in for socioeconomic stuff?
Well,
It often is. Yeah.
I'm actually like, maybe I don't want to derail, so maybe somebody else go first. But I really just don't want to like talk about racism as this like awful thing, so long as it remains an idea. Like when racism becomes an action, that's when I find a problem. So like maybe this is derailing your topic because you want to talk about how like action could be based on classism versus racism. For me, racism, I don't give a shit. Somebody's got like an idea in their mind that like I'm better than you, you're better than me. Fuck it, yeah, have that. I'm fine. Like it doesn't hurt me. Go ahead. Like it's when you try to
words.
when you impose that opinion in an action verb. Now we got a problem.
Yeah, someone in a place of power has that view, then that's
Right.
when it turns into action.
Like
Yeah.
what I would say to you is microaggressions. You heard of microaggressions?
Oh,
like
God.
you would think that what you're doing actionably is not racist. You're like, so it's not racist. I care about actions. And then somebody else comes along and they create this new concept. They're like, that was a microaggression. Actually, I know you weren't outwardly intending to be racist, but what you did. So like, it's not even so simple as like in your head's fine and like actions are bad. Like we're also redefining which actions are bad or good. Even stuff that like we're taking a lot of
Steven,
intent away.
inaction is also.
That's a good point. Now inaction is also
Good one.
like
Good
we're
one.
just like
You can't just not be racist.
It's racist if you don't fight for minorities.
Only a lunatic would say that.
yeah.
That's the level of like, if you don't even want something to be your problem and you stand off to the side, but you're in a position of privilege and you don't do something about it and you don't speak on it and there's no action, you're racist.
It's racism if you don't use race as your filter for how you should decide on an action.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It all
I was
comes-
clarifying.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's rough. Like, no, like a lot of these ideologies, like from the extremes of both ends, like it's funny. They like eventually just wrap in on each
Yeah.
other and they become incoherent and they keep like making additional rules to justify the gap in the rule. And then you end up with this like tortured reasoning where like nobody can even make sense of it. But then that almost becomes like the feature, not the bug. Like it's like Scientology where you have to ascend to more and more levels of absurdity and language that you have to use to be in the club. And if you're not, it's just so ridiculous now.
So how do we what do we envision as a way to actually move society forward in a way that solves it? And I think to the root of the question as well, like I'm still curious, like, do you guys believe people are innately born with a certain level of like racism? So it's kind of a two-part question, but
Perhaps, but I think the best way to fight it is bottom up, like you said. All you can control is yourself. Just don't be racist. Boom.
I would agree with you if we didn't have systemic racism now, because now it doesn't matter what the individual components of the system do. They can make up a larger system that acts in a way that is sort of racist in a way that isn't like identifiable in a specific like, ooh, that's racist,
Right.
but we can point to an outcome that's produced and be like, well, that clearly that outcome is racist because there's a disparity there.
Right, you're talking about like an educational system, a criminal justice system. Like those are top-down things that exist. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, you individually just don't be racist. It can't be.
It assumes like a priori that like, of course, this system would not have this many black people in jail and this many white people in jail. So from that starting point, we can conclude that the system is racist. And there's probably some element of truth in that, but it probably also skips over a lot of like nuanced, difficult to talk about stuff in the middle there. And people like want to throw that out and just be like, we don't want to talk about that uncomfortable stuff. We're just going to be like, system racist, results different, and we're just going to forcibly like crowbar like equality into the system.
Yeah, so when it comes to like what should we do, I try to think of like what does progress look like, and I think it is this like neutral aspect when it comes to race. And right now we measure things, right? We measure how many African Americans or Asians are in Harvard. How many minority Fortune 500 CEOs we have, but we don't measure like how many green eye colored people or brunettes are in Harvard, or how many people that any belly button or like CEO of a Fortune 500 company. So like, should we stop measuring those? Should we stop measuring, what races are incarcerated for, as a percentage of the population? Because like, if I was running a business and I didn't really want to optimize for something, I just wanted to like things to happen on their merits, I wouldn't measure
I
it.
sort of like how your answer is the top-down version of don't be racist.
Well, right.
What you brought up is a good point. Like, why do we care so much about skin color versus other traits?
Because of the historical context, because we've never gone after people with green eyes or outy belly buttons, and we have some work to do to make up for the racism that has existed.
But here's a good
individuals
example
and
of this.
systems.
We care about fat people, right? We've gone out of our way to basically say, it's okay that you're morbidly obese. It's all these things, like we've bent over backwards for fat, but they're treated differently in society, right? So we care about that, and it's non-racial. Here's something nobody cares about: height. You don't hear anybody talking about like we need to like have like height equality for men. But if you look at the data, like you are at a severe disadvantage in life as like a 6'7" guy versus a 5'0" man.
Speak
right?
for yourself, brother.
Never felt a problem, brother.
Short king over here. Absolute king. But like, I think that's like an interesting difference to me. Like society, we do care about this non-racial element, like obesity. We hear about like fat shaming, all this stuff all the time. Nobody gives a damn about like the height thing. And I suspect it's because it's mostly men affected by the height thing. So people don't
All
care.
right. Yeah, I get that. I'll
Maybe
take
I'm
one.
spicing this up too much.
No. I think I'll like lower my expectations for progress. I would like to just generally the majority of population agree that we want race to have the same moral significance as height. Like we're definitely not there right now. But like to me, that would be progress. Initially, for now.
These are longer term games than we imagine. These are like generational games.
Absolutely generational.
So
yeah.
I think we are seeing progress. It's just happens slowly.
Right.
Yeah.
Where do you land?
I think that the conversation that we see society having in the media and on social media is very different to the conversation that really exists in the real world. And I've been watching this unfold more and more recently, where I get in an Uber or Lyft, or I'm at the park and I bump into somebody and I'm in a different, and I'm not just talking about San Diego, I'm talking about all over the world in different places. And the conversation I seem to be having more and more frequently is like, we see way more eye to eye than like everyone else wants us to believe. And all of this madness, and even this like idea of like the woke ideas that exist, it's a small subset of people that really feel that way. The rest of society is just like, can we just get on with life? Can we get on and move on from the pandemic? Can we move on from racism? Can we just treat each other equally, because we already do? I believe the majority of people are actually completely okay. Everyone respects each other for the most part. Do they have like certain elements of prejudice and discrimination that have existed for generations in their families? Absolutely. Does it serve them at times? I don't know. Arguably, maybe not. I don't think today in the melting pot globalized culture that we see, it really serves you anymore. And so people are learning to let go. And like, you have a generation like us, and then the generation that will come after us is going to be completely different. It's just a game of evolution. The grandma, those ideas are obsolete. They served her for a time and they no longer serve her anymore. And those ideas are gone. And I think we're focused on solving problems that don't exist. I think we're chasing ghosts. And I think that really we should be putting our energy toward just like living the good life. Everyone's okay. Maybe, have a glass of wine, do some mushrooms. I'm not kidding about that, because I'm really becoming like, especially after this docuseries, an advocate for this. I really feel like it's not a panacea, but the unifying factor that is missing for most people is that the differences are always made up. These meat wagon things that we walk around in are completely they're made up. And most people know that in their soul, and they know that in their true like hearts, but they forget that. And like a little exercise and going to like another country and talking to people offline, and you'll see, I think we're way closer than people realize. That doesn't mean that we're not going to go through some crazy shit
I agree with you.
over the
I
next
just
5
wrote
to
down
10
a new
years.
topic because I want to actually have a discussion on how like traditional media is polarizing us to have these like different outcomes than actually represent our,
and it's not us
our-
doing it.
right. And like, how do you fix that? How do you
I think
operate
if you had
well?
like 2 extremely different people sitting at this table of different political spectrum,
It'd be a
like
freaking
far
handshake.
right, far left, they'd figure out a way to talk through it
Anyway.
for the most part.
If the previous silent majority was like the Appalachian whites that did meth and were like poor, now the like silent majority I think is the radical moderates. They don't get enough talk. So
Let's go,
Amen,
baby.
Here we
brother.
Let's go.
That's a great point.
It's a good place to wrap.
Yeah.
Sure.
Love it.
We're talking about the goat of all goats, the goat human of all time, not just on a category level, but literally the greatest
Wait,
human
don't
of
you
all
need
time.
to do
next.
another intro?
Yeah, but this is the wrap.
Oh, this is the
Steven.
this
is the teaser.
the outro.
This is the outro to get you to come back
This
to
is
the
good.
next
This
episode.
is
Are you
gonna
going to
be
come
a funny
back?
take. No,
I
I'm
can't
gone.
wait to hear your take.
I'm gone.
All right. We'll see you guys in the next episode.
Later.
Later.
Peace.